This year marks 30 years since the Rwanda genocide, where members of the majority Hutu ethnic group killed an estimated 800,000 minority Tutsis. Author Pie-Pacifique Kabalira-Uwase recounts his experience of the genocide in a book entitled Witnessing: From the Rwandan Tragedy to Healing in South Africa. He joins me in studio to talk about the collective trauma that Africa still has to overcome, even when some countries boast decades of liberation and independence. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time.
Such a pleasure to be here.
Well, of course, I mean, we're having this conversation in the same week that, the presidents of Rwanda and South Africa, together with a whole host of other heads of state, gathered in Kigali to commemorate this tragedy. Just as you are this week watching, all these visuals from Rwanda, reading articles that people have penned. What went through your mind? What preoccupied your thoughts?
It is a great coincidence that it is also happening as the Middle East is unfolding. There is talks of possible genocide happening. And even since the World War II, we hear never again. Then Rwanda happens, never again. Then Darfur happens, never again. Now, possibly genocide in Palestine. So that is actually, as you ask me what is top of mind, is there something that we are missing as humanity, that we keep repeating the same thing over and over and over again? It is sobering. At the same time, when you look at the contrast between Rwanda then and Rwanda now, and other countries that have overcome great tragedies to be on a path of democracy and prosperity, it can only give hope. There's a lot of good news all around the continent. So it is still a mixed bag, and we still have a lot of work to do, because all of these events, they cause a lot of trauma. And that trauma has to be acknowledged, and it has to be dealt with. And I suspect that there isn't enough emphasis, enough work on that.
We'll work on what you think should happen. But are you able to answer that very question you posed? In other words, is there something that we are missing as humanity?
I can tell you, I was reflecting the other day about the construct of the narrative. The story can be anywhere in the world, but it goes like this. They did something to us, and they are about to do more if we don't do something to defend ourselves. And otherwise, we will be non-existent. We will be annihilated. You can say that about Israel today. That's exactly what in Rwanda they were saying. If we don't do what we are supposed to do, i.e. commit these atrocities, it is our very being, our very nature, our very dignity that is at stake. You can take it in any context where there is going to be a genocide. There is some kind of justification, but it sounds always the same. So how do we break that? And that's, I think, one of the things that we tend to forget, is that our leaders are also human beings. And the kind of trauma that we talk about, they would have experienced as they grow up. They would have experienced as they rise to political power, sometimes through violent systems. So the trauma is not just for the ordinary person. The trauma is also in our leaders. But I think the very fact that leadership and that responsibility clouds the space for the personal work that needs to be done. And for me, I think it needs to be done at the leadership level and cascaded down. Otherwise, we will forever be talking about generational trauma.
We are in this country, about 8 weeks to an election. Everybody is talking about lack of service delivery, lack of compassion from leaders for the poor. It talks about lack of the devil-may-care attitude where people don't think that the people or the lesser mortals, you know, they don't care about them. They don't even think about them. Do you think that in such situations, right, leaders even think about what you've just spoken about?
And that is the tragedy.
They can't give people water.
That is the tragedy of it.
Food. Yeah. Right? Would they even think about the issues they're raising?
The issues. And that is the tragedy, because now it sounds and feels like we are trapped. I look at, when I was writing this book, I had to do a lot of work myself to be able to tell this story. I look at the effort that it took me. I look at what I need to be in place in order for me to write the story. And it's a privilege that is only available to very few people. It's very difficult to think about trauma and the past and the story if you don't have water, if you don't have food. But at the same time, there is a causal link between the trauma, the consequences of that trauma, and the very conditions in which we are living. So, yes, we can bring about some of these solutions, but most of the time it's just a plaster on a bigger wound. So there needs to be a parallel process. While we are fighting to provide basic necessities for our people, we also need to think about how do we collectively find healing, use resources that are available. Because, for example, here in South Africa, there are resources. For example, all students at the university level, they have student counseling center. I know universities put a lot of resources towards that, but they are largely underutilized. People who work for big organizations, they would have a number they can call to have some kind of psychological help. There is a lot of nuclear, a lot of points where in South Africa you can actually be heard and have empathetic listeners. But people are not even aware of that because they are preoccupied with the basics. And so that is, and the basics, that preoccupation actually leads to a situation where we are only living through the highlights of our own history because we never have an opportunity to dive into the very history and the very story so we can be able to heal from that trauma.
Speaking of diving to, you know, was someone who may have been listening to what, especially what you said in the past minute, may think of it sort of in very academic and broad terms. When you said that even to write this book, right, I mean, you're a survivor of the genocide yourself. And to write this book, you needed certain things, you know, that were going to enable you to tell the story. What are we talking about? If we decode that, what exactly are we talking about? Did you need an environment? Did you need money? What exactly are we talking about?
So, the opportunity arose when in 2014 I finally had means to be out of work for about 8 months without working, and I would be fine. Now, that is not something that an average person is going to say in a lifetime, can do. Now, when I got that opportunity, I also was privileged to be working with an organization that understood that I needed this time to retreat and process. Now, I also needed people around me who can help me process this. And this happened over a number of years. The most difficult chapter I had to write was chapter 24 in the book, where I'm actually talking about one of those moments where I was processing a traumatic event that happened in 1994 in Rwanda. When I was writing that chapter, I was not sure if I'm really conveying what was happening in that room, because in essence, I was not in that room. I was in my memory. I was processing what was happening. So I wanted to bring the reader into that process because I was not a witness to that process myself, because I was in it. But what I know is that the people who were in that room had the skills and had the compassion and had the empathy to be able to hold me as it was happening. And these are not instances that happen often to most people. So I'm extremely privileged to have been able to do that. Even in Rwanda, most people would rather not talk about what happened because there is rarely an opportunity to do that safely. And it is that safety that is missing.
Now, I mean, you were, what, 13?
I was 13, yes.
Yeah. When it all happened. And I'm trying to process, like, how a grown-up man like you now, you know, must have been going through over the years, and especially getting closer to the time of writing the book, what then, you know, your ability to recall, but to reconstruct certain things, but also with the other experiences post, which may have influenced both your thinking and at times perhaps even raised doubt in your own mind about certain things and what the world now thinks or is able to say about things that happened to you at a very personal level. Yeah.
So before I answer that question, I'd like to say people who have read Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, the very last paragraph, it ends with the commissioner, colonizer, saying, oh, this man's story will make compelling reading. Maybe a paragraph, not a chapter, but just a paragraph. Now, we've just been reading a whole book, a whole intricate story of this man, and it ends with somebody simply reducing it to a mere paragraph. Now, I can tell you that when I had the opportunity to dive into it, first of all, these events that happen in moments of high emotions, they don't disappear. Some of the details, they fade. Some of the events also fade. But there are some, like the ones, I didn't write everything. I wrote the ones I was sure to still remember, that simply do not leave you. As a 13-year-old, if you step outside of your own home, you go to the streets, and people you might know are hacking to death people you might know. It's not easy to forget that. There are people whose last words I still remember. It's not easy to forget that. But there are some details that, there are events that I remember, I saw it happen, but I cannot explain how I was there because my memory failed me. Those I omitted. I left out. So what I wrote in the book is what I remember with certainty. Now, as an adult, I was also privileged, and this is where I bring back the work we need to do as adults. Our behaviors and the way we process things sometimes can be indications of what happened to us earlier. So I was privileged to be trained to notice my relationship about money, relationships with people, relationships with, what happens to me when I hear army, the word army. Then I can go in and see what is being triggered. Then I can go back and say, oh, this is what is being pressed within me emotionally. But if I don't have the time and the space to process these emotions, because I'm worried about where the next bread is going to come from, because I'm worried about my job, because I have a work assignment, it's just not going to work.
Can I ask you to hold your thoughts right there? We're going to take a very quick ad break, but I still want us to finish this conversation.
Thank you.
In about 30 seconds or so. It's time to take a quick ad break. This conversation continues in a moment.
Yeah.
If you just joined us, I'm in conversation with author Pie-Pacifique Kabalira-Uwase, author of a book, Witnessing is the title of the book, From the Rwandan Tragedy to Healing in South Africa. Now, we have a few minutes, a couple of minutes left. I just want us to now say, obviously, the importance of recording our own experiences, lived experiences, and history has to be underscored. But as people living in these times, yes, as you said right at the beginning, these tragedies continue to happen. We are dealing, as we speak, with what is happening in Palestine. What do we need to do as people to answer, to try and answer that question, whether there is something we are missing as humanity?
There is a level of collective responsibility that we need to take, because one of the fundamental rights that we have is right to justice. At the same time, absolute justice is almost impossible to achieve. There need to be some level of letting go, and that is a painful thing to tell anybody, because what can be absolute justice for a child who witnessed his family being killed? You can take the people who killed them in jail. Is that absolute justice? And does that bring about healing? Only a part of it is helpful. So while we are looking for justice, we also need to look for ways to help the people who go through that kind of pain to heal. And there are some techniques, and perhaps that's where we start losing it when we use the word technique and psychology and psychologists and all of that. But there are some ways we can interact as human beings that acknowledges that we come from a very deep story. There's more to us than what is being seen, than what is being heard.
See, I mean, this becomes very important, because for someone like me who has experienced both worlds, I mean, I lived and I grew up under apartheid, but also got to experience some of the best of what democracy has come to offer. But at the same time, as someone who, with the job that I have to do, I listen to politicians who blame it on apartheid, when in many instances I feel that they too dropped the ball when they got the opportunity to correct the wrongs of apartheid. It puts us in a bit of a quagmire, a very tricky situation, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely. And it takes, I think it's going to take a less blaming and more, what is my role now? Because if you look at South Africa, for example, apartheid, the way it ended in the fullness of time, it was abrupt. It was apartheid in the 90s, and then 94, it was gone, there were elections. And then men and women with great willingness took over the responsibility. But think about the context they were coming from. Depravity, being hunted, being in fear all the time, imprisoned. Those experiences would have done something to them. Did they have a chance to have a moment to process that? And how does that actually inform what they do when they are in positions of responsibility, especially when we talk about depravity? Because it doesn't just disappear because you changed positions or because you changed context. An individual has to kind of update their soulware, their inner thinking, in order for that to change. If it doesn't change, you can be a victim of apartheid during apartheid, then you can be somebody in responsibility after apartheid. The same software inside that is running is the same. So it's going to lead to catastrophic consequences. And I suspect that this is one of the things we are living through in South Africa.
I mean, there's a strong argument being made that maybe young people should take over, because they do not have as much of the baggage that some of us went through, and maybe that's when we'll start seeing very real and meaningful change throughout our continent.
Absolutely. And the young people, they need to be mentored. They need to be given the opportunity of not just consuming the single story, because the way the stories are told, it's always in a way that is carefully curated. But for a young man to really have the fullness of what is needed in order for them to grow into leadership, they need to have a full perspective, and that needs to be allowed. And unfortunately, I think on the continent, we are seeing the erasing of our own histories, because the story is always told from one side. That is one. The second one is actually, again, as I end, is to develop more empathy and more compassion towards each other, just as we interact every single day.
Pie-Pacifique, let me thank you very much for your time, for coming through, but also for spending time with us here.
Thank you so much.
This afternoon. He's, of course, the author of the book Witnessing, From the Rwandan Tragedy to Healing in South Africa.